Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hey, guess what? We're back for our BGCSI online book club, and I'm getting my mobile setup going here. And so I want to get tuned in so I connect with y'all. So while everyone is sharing and getting the alerts on their phone and hitting that button, I'm going to be pulling up the stream as well so we can all be tuned in together and see. Yep, there we go. Got it here. Let me go ahead and press mute. Don't need to hear myself. Alrighty, so we are here and we are getting ready for chapter 14 of our book, The Hatchet. Man, 13 left us with some great places, but let's get some housekeeping things out the way. We just want to let you know that supper is going to be served at the Boys and Girls Club, 250 North Springer Street in just about, where's the clock? 16 minutes. So, well, actually 26 minutes. Yes, 3:30 Central Time that we'll be serving our lunches here. I know people are tuning in from all over. We thank everyone for joining in. But if you want some supper, we're serving it this week. We thank you for connecting with us. And we're going to jump right into things. Chapter 14 of The Hatchet. In chapter 13, it started off, we see Brian progressing. He came from a low place in chapter 12 where he had hit rock bottom. He saw a plane, heard the plane, saw it flying away. He couldn't get a signal up quick enough. He tragically tried to do some things and say, hey, I don't want to deal with this no more. But he hit rock bottom. And yet again, our word for this book has been the word called resiliency. And we are reminding ourselves to stay resilient. Brian said, you know what? Even though I feel like all hope is lost, this is the new me now, and the new me has to survive. And because the new me has to survive, guess what? Now we're going to go ahead and live life the best that we can. And so he's made a bow and arrow so he could fish with. He still has his hatchet, so now he's eating good food. He had his first feast that he called it. And so I think that it is. And I love how chapter 13 ended. But hope in his knowledge, hope in the fact that he could learn and survive and take care of himself. Tough hope, he thought that night. I am full of tough hope. I mean, that in of itself is great because we can have a hope in something, but we have to know sometimes that even though we hope in something, it can be tough and doesn't mean it's going to magically happen. And he realized he had a human responsibility and he has to put in the work. So we're going on, jumping in with chapter 14 here, and let us begin. Mistakes. Small mistakes could turn into disasters. Funny little mistakes could snowball so that while you were still smiling at humor, you could find yourself looking at death. In the city, if you made a mistake, usually there was a way to rectify it. Make it all right. If he fell on his bike and sprained a leg, he could wait for it to heal. If he forgot something at the store, he could find other food in the refrigerator. Now, it was different. And also quick. Also incredibly quick. If he sprained a leg here, he might starve before he could get around again. If he missed while he was hunting, or if the fish moved away, he might starve. If he got sick, really sick, so that he couldn't move, he might starve. Mistakes. Early in the new time, he had learned the most important thing, the truly vital knowledge that drives all creatures in the forest. Food is all. Food was simply everything. All things in the woods, from insects to fish to bears, were always looking for food. It was the great single driving influence in nature, to eat. All must eat. But the way he learned it almost killed him. His second new night, stomach full of fish and the fire smoldering in the shelter, he had been sound asleep when something, he thought later it might be smell, had awakened him. Near the fire, completely unafraid of the smoking coals, completely unafraid of Brian, a skunk was digging where he had buried the eggs. There was some sliver of moon, and in the faint pearl light he could see the bushy tail and white stripes down the back. He had nearly smiled. He did not know how the skunk had found the eggs. Some smell, perhaps. Some tiny, fragrant shell had left the smell. But it looked almost cute. Its little head down and its little tail up as it dug, kicking the sand. But those were his eggs, not the skunk's. And the half-smile had been quickly replaced with fear that he would lose his food, and he had grabbed a handful of sand and thrown it at the skunk. Get out of here! He was going to say more, Some silly human words. But in less than half a second, the skunk had snapped its rear end up, curved its tail over, and sprayed Brian with a direct shot aimed at his head from less than 4 feet away. In the tiny confines of the shelter, the effects were devastating. The thick, sulfurous, rotten odor filled the small room, heavy, ugly, and stinking. The corrosive spray that hit his face seared into his lungs and eyes, blinding him. He screamed and threw himself sideways, making the entire wall of the shelter. Taking the entire wall off the shelter, screamed and clawed out of the shelter and ran to the shore of the lake. Stumbling and tripping, he scrambled into the water and slammed his head back and forth, trying to wash his eyes, slashing at the water to clear his eyes. 100 funny cartoons he had seen about skunks. Cute cartoons about the smell of skunks, cartoons to laugh at and joke about. But when the spray hit, there was nothing funny about it. He was completely blind for almost 2 hours. A lifetime. He thought that he might be permanently blind or at least impaired, and that would have been the end. As it was, the pain in his eyes lasted for days, bothered him after that for 2 weeks. The smell in the shelter, the clothes, and his hairs was still there now, almost a month and a half later. And he had nearly smiled. Mistakes. Food had to be protected. While he was in the lake trying to clear his eyes, the skunk went ahead and dug up the rest of the turtle eggs and ate every one. Licked all the shells clean and couldn't have cared less that Brian was thrashing around in the water like a dying carp. The skunk had found food, and it was taking it in, and Brian was paying for a lesson. Protect food and have good shelter. Not just a shelter to keep the wind and rain out, but a shelter to protect, a shelter to make him safe. The day after the skunk, he set out to make a good place to live. The basic idea had been good. The place for his shelter was right, but he just hadn't gone far enough. He'd been lazy. But now he knew the second most important thing about nature. What drives nature? Food was first. But the work for the food went on and on. Nothing in nature was lazy. He had tried to take a shortcut and paid for it with his turtle eggs, which he had come to like more than chicken eggs from the store. They had been fuller somehow, had more depth to them. He set about improving his shelter by tearing it down. From dead pines up the hill, he brought down heavier logs and fastened some of them across the opening, wedging them at the top and burying them in the bottom in the sand. Then he wove long branches in through them to make a truly tight wall, and still not satisfied. He took even thinner branches and wove those into the first weave. Then, when he was last finished, he could not find a place to put his fist through. It all held together like a very stiff woven basket. He judged the door opening to be the weakest spot, and here he took special time to weave a door of willows so tight that a mesh, no matter how a skunk tried, or a porcupine, he thought, looking at the marks on his legs, it could not possibly get through. He had no hinges, but by arranging some cut-off limbs at the top in the right way, he had a method to hook the door in place. And when he was in and the door was hung, he felt relatively safe. A bear, something big, could still get in by tearing at it, but nothing small could bother him, and the weave of the structure still allowed the smoke to filter up through the top and out. All in all, it took him 3 days to make the shelter, stopping to shoot fish and eat as he went, bathing 4 times a day to try to get the smell from the skunk to leave. When his house was finally done, he turned to the constant problem: food. It was all right to hunt and eat, or fish and eat, but what happened if he had to go a long time without food? What happened when the berries were gone and he's sick or hurt? Thinking of the skunk, laid up temporarily. He needed a way to store food. He needed a place for it. He tried to learn from his mistakes. He couldn't bury food again, couldn't leave it in the shelter because something like a bear could get at it right away. It had to be high, somehow high and safe. Above the door to the shelter, up the rock face about 10 feet, was a small ledge that could make a natural storage place, unreachable to animals, except that it was unreachable to him as well. A ladder, of course. He needed a ladder, but he had no way to fashion one, nothing to hold the steps on, and that stopped him until he found a dead pine with many small branches on it sticking out. Using his hatchet, he chopped the branches off so they stuck out about 4 or 5 inches, all up along the log. And then he cut the log off about 10 feet long, dragged it down to his shelter, and it was a little heavy, but dry and he could manage it. When he propped it up, he found he could climb to the ledge with ease. though the tree did roll from side to side a bit as he climbed. His food shelf, as he thought of it, had been covered with bird manure, and he carefully scraped it clean with sticks. He had never seen birds there, but that was probably because the smoke from his fire went right up across the opening, and they didn't like smoke. Still, he had learned, and he had took time to weave a snug door for the small opening with green willows, cutting it so it jammed in tightly. And when he finished, he stood back and looked at the rock face, his shelter below, the food shelf above, and allowed a small bit of pride to come. Not too bad, he thought. Not bad for someone who used to have trouble greasing the bearings of his bicycles. Not bad at all. Mistakes. He had made a good shelter and food shelf, but he had no food except for fish and the last of the berries. And the fish, as they still tasted then, were not something he could store. His mother had left some salmon out by mistake one time when they went on an overnight trip to Cape Hester to visit relatives. And when he got back, the smell filled the whole house. There was no way to store fish. At least, he thought, no way to store them dead. But as he looked at the weave of the structure, a thought came to him, and he moved down to the water. He had been putting the waste from the fish back in the water, and the food attracted hundreds of new ones. I wonder, they seemed to come easily to the food, at least the small ones. He had no trouble now shooting them, and he even speared one with his old fish spear now that he knew to aim low. He could dangle something in his fingers, and they came right up to it. It might be possible, he thought, might just be possible to trap them, make some kind of pond. To his right, at the base of the rock bluff, there are piles of smaller rocks that had fallen from the main chunk, splinters and hunks, from double fist size to some as large as his head. He spent an afternoon carrying rocks to the beach and making what amounted to a large fish pen for holding live fish. 2 rock arms that stuck out 15 feet into the lake and curved together at the end. Where the arms came together, he left an opening about 2 feet across. Then he sat on the shore and waited. When he had first started dropping all the rocks, the fish darted away. But his fish trash pile of bones and skins and guts were in the pond area, and the prospect of food brought them back. Soon, under an hour, there were 30 or 40 small fish in the enclosure, and Brian had made a gate by weaving small willows together into a fine mesh and closed them in. "Fresh fish," he yelled. "I have fresh fish for sale." Storing live fish to eat later had been a major breakthrough, he thought. It wasn't just keeping him from starving. It was trying to save ahead, think ahead. Of course, he didn't know how sick he would get of fish. Well, that concludes chapter 14. Yet again, the resiliency of this young man, the ingenuity, very intuitive, that's the right word, very intuitive in how he's formulating a plan and taking problems. I like how he talked about one of the themes of this chapter was basically mistakes, and how learning from his mistakes is something that he's taking as a positive. Yet again, if we can take something away from this chapter, is to learn and see that the mistakes we make are not our failures. The mistakes we make are not the things that should hold us back, but those are the things that should teach us and push us forward to do what we need to do. And Brian here in this book is not letting his mistakes hold him back, but he's letting his mistakes be the launching pad for him to be successful. And I think that's something we could all take away from this chapter, that our success should be built upon our mistakes. No one hits it out the park the first time, every time. And so we should always keep that in mind. But yet again, another great chapter. Thank you guys so much for tuning in on chapter 14. I believe by the end of this week, we'll be done with this book. So you're going to start to see, we're going to put a poll up. We're going to want to poll and see, hey, by the end of this week, what has the most votes for the next book that we're going to be reading. So be on the lookout for that. Some other housekeeping things. Please know, starting very shortly, we're going to be serving supper from 3:30 to 5:30. Please come by, grab a meal, grab an enrichment bag. We have so many things that we're offering to the community. So please, we just want to be a resource and help in this time of need. And that if you guys will join us back here tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we'll go for chapter 15. And yet again, we'll be doing lunches from 12 to 1:30 for the rest of the week. And we'll be doing suppers from 3:30 to 5:30. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.